Now, in everyday life, there are a number of individuals who often influence the way that we interpret the world around us. What are the people like who help us interpret worlds that aren't real? The fantasy and sci-fi worlds that we play our games within. Now, I'm going to venture that a lot of the influence comes from one of two distinct media. It's either by authors who get us to visualize images within our heads with the way they play with words and description. And then there's also the artists who lay down sublime artworks for us that let us interpret a fantasy or sci-fi world in whatever given way. This video is, for me, the video about the most important one of those artists. Not important because every piece of artwork he's ever done is wonderful, which again I think it is because I'm a complete fanboy of his work, but also because of the role and responsibility he had within the industry as a whole. And I'm talking about Mr. John Blanche. Now, John Blanche has been a name that's been linked to the fantasy and sci-fi industries since the 1970s. He's been responsible for a number of definitive works. Not bad for someone who was told at art college that although he had a romantic soul, nobody would ever offer him a job painting trolls, demons, dragons and goblins, so he might as well give it up. In early 1970s, John was a freelance artist, and a lot of his work can be seen in a lot of different publications. First most, the Tolkien Compendium, for which John submitted a couple of the artworks that appears in that book. Secondly, he worked with Steve Jackson, one of the original Games Workshop founders and one of the Fighting Fantasy original writers, on his Sorcery series of books. He was commissioned by Games Workshop to produce the first UK cover art for Dungeons and Dragons. So everybody within the role-play fraternity within the UK might owe a debt of gratitude to John as well, and just not tied within Games Workshop for a number of years, producing a couple of cover artworks for White Dwarf magazine in the early days, White Dwarf number 4 and White Dwarf number 7. And then in 1983 created one of his most celebrated artworks, the cover artwork for the box work of the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. In 1986, Games Workshop moved to Nottingham, and the then new manager, Brian Ansell, appointed John as the art director for Games Workshop. He immediately became responsible for the company over all the freelance artists, the miniature designers, and anyone else who had a role within the design aspects of the Games Workshop business. So therefore became very founding and important member of the Games Workshop. In fact, when we talk about Games Workshop, we can't really talk about much that hasn't seen the influence of John's work. 40k players will often talk about the grimdark aesthetic of Warhammer 40k. This is something that would not be possible without John's influence. Talked about the Blanche painting style, a style of imagery where people go about trying to recreate the imagery of John's paintings in their miniature painting. John's style is automatically identifiable, owing a lot to a lot more sketch work that can be seen in books, so like the Inquisitor's Sketchbook, to his more finished pieces that if you wanted to see a collection of them in one book, then the book Rat Spike that he did with Ian Miller is probably the tome to go through, and that's coffee table art book that you can show off to your friends. John's early work tended to be created using technical drawing pencils and technical drawing pens, which were then overlaid with watercolour washes. But as he moved into the collection of models and tried to put his aesthetic onto the models himself, he moved into other medium, gouaches, acrylics, oils, all these new mediums now that a lot of people, a lot of painters within the fantasy genre are saying these are the cheating styles, these are the ways that you get results without having any talent, etc., etc. But it was literally someone like John who paved the way for the use of these types of medium in the tabletop industry. John's style itself is again recognisable because of the colour palette he uses. Now, John attended art college, so he was open to the influence from many artists from different classical and romantic styles. And one of the ones that comes more to the fore is an artist called Anders Zorn. Because if we can be seen that when we look at the washes and the sketch style that John uses, he relies on the three colours that make up what's defined as the Zorn palette. And again, it's this Zorn palette that a lot of people who are in to the Blanche aesthetic use for creating their models. Interpretation for John is literal and to be enjoyed for what it is. Often his drawings, he's inviting the viewer to appreciate the technique, the use of colour, use of atmosphere, and then the narrative background that's been used to create the artwork itself. Many paintings that he's done throughout the years have graced the pages of various fantasy tomes for years. But there was one that he created where he was trying to actually produce a deliberate, what he called a deliberate response within the fantasy genre itself. And that was the image that was used for White Dwarf number 78, the Amazonia Gothic. Again, a lot of people who play Necromunda would see where this influence has ended up. But the comment he was trying to make, and I'm going to quote him here from an interview he did, that he was utterly sick with seeing brilliant artists producing painting after painting of near naked females with chests the size of airships. Elements of the style of fantasy art were creeping onto the front of White Dwarf, and he was receiving letters on a weekly basis complaining on what people saw as exploitation of the female form. Now, it's not so long ago that we had statements and movements within social media talk about the acceptance of hobby for all. Well, you can see that back in the late 70s, early 80s, John was already fighting that fight for people. So again, maybe something that he needs to be appreciated for, apart from just the quality of the artwork he oversaw. So for almost 30 years, John has been one of the guiding lights in the fantasy art industry. But now it's 2023, and John himself has decided to step down as one of the godfathers of this sci-fi and fantasy artwork. And he's decided to leave his post at Games Workshop and retire himself to whatever else is in his future or on the horizon for him. I only hope that, you know, he can be proud and look back at the legacy he's left, not only with Games Workshop, but with the industry as a whole. And I hope this is not the last piece of John Blanche artwork we ever get privy to see. Because if I was a games company manufacturer, I'd be biting bits off people to get the chance to work with John. So what are my favourites? Well, it's pretty hard for me to go through the full list of John's work, and there's very many people who would point out images like the images he did of the 40k Emperor sitting on his throne, one of the most used and most influenced picture that's used in that whole genre. He's got his image that he first created, the Sister of Battle. So I would like to talk about three particularly that had probably the most profound effect on me, and still images that I love to look back at now. The first one, it was issue number 83 of White Dwarf. Now, issue 83 of White Dwarf includes the image of the Knight's Panther. To me, this is an image about what a hero is. Just the way that you can see that the knightly figure on board his steed, charging out into the wilderness to chase down some bad guys, or to a village that's beset by some kind of horror, etc., etc., or to fantasy trope, save the maiden in distress. This to me is what a fantasy hero should be, and I can only say that now with the old world coming back, that images and models based on this artwork can only come back as well. So I'm quite looking forward to see if they will reissue the Knight's Panther former. So we'll have to see how that one goes. The next one is one that was used on a box art for a game. Now, John's artwork has been used on countless box arts for Games Workshop over the years. There's his drawing of the Skeleton Horde, which was I believe the Restless Dead army box. You had the original box set, which had the 12 metal Chaos Dwarves in it, and the cover of that one, again, a John Blanche original. But the one I want to go for is the cover of the Lich Master. To me, this is what a fantasy battle should look like. Here we've got a wizard type character stood in the middle of a battle, surrounded by enemies of skaven skeletons, and in the background this otherworldly image of the Lich Master in the sky, controlling his army by the dark magic that he possesses to raise the skeletons from the dead. This to me is a proper fantasy warfare. And the final one is probably one of the reasons I collected an army that I did back in my old world days, back in the late 80s going into the early 90s, where I was a Dwarf army player. Now this image is called The Awakening, and it depicts an army of dwarves that seem to have been rallied from local city, town, stronghold, wherever, and are entering the field of battle to meet with some enemy that we cannot see from the picture. Just the stoic, heroic imagery that each one of those dwarves on that image possesses made me want a dwarf armour. And now with Old World coming back, it's again opened up the potential for that dwarf army to be recaptured on the table again. So let's hope Old World comes quite quickly. So I'm going to make a plea from Games Workshop. Now, something that come out, I believe it was for now 8th edition of 40k, the Dark Millennium set. People can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on that one. But John created a deck of cards where each card had an individual one of his sketches about the 40k universe on, and it was a set of playing cards. Now, I never picked them up when they first come round, because again, I'm not a 40k player. I very rarely, apart from things like Inquisitor, have really any much interest in paraphernalia of Warhammer 40k coming through the pipeline. So I never saw this when it first came out. But I'd really like a set of these cards. And I know Games Workshop has got, now and again, the ability to re-release things from yesteryear to make a few quid on. So do us a favour, Games Workshop. Re-release the cards, because I don't really want to pay the money that they're going for on eBay. So that's it. My thanks to John Blanche, probably, like I said, the person who's had the most influence on the way that I see the fantasy worlds that I play in. The person who's responsible for the way I paint my miniatures, for what miniatures that I find pleasing to myself. And always when I'm looking at the creation of armies, the creation of colours that are going to work together, instead of WWJD standing for what would Jesus do, you always ask yourself, what would John do? So thanks again for listening to this old man, and remember, no matter where your games take place, whether it's in the darkest dungeons or in the highest starships, I'm sure there's a piece of John Blanche artwork that's there for you.